Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
How are you this morning, Dr. Paul?
I'm doing very well.
Good.
And I'm going to get you to talk a little bit about how we're going to preserve our right to free expression, because sometimes even we are under attack, and many others that are similar. It's not a laughing matter; it's a serious thing. But as we'll try to point out, that the problem today is a lot different, and we talked a little bit about, there's been a freedom of attack on people's expression for a long time. All the way back to a long time. Certainly Lincoln believed in silencing his challengers, as well as Woodrow Wilson and FDR, and all of them do it. Even as recent as Obama, they do it. But now it's getting to be different, because it's a lot of technology involved. And we just went over an article on John Whitehead, and he's an expert on protection of civil liberties and protection of privacy. And I think of him being one of the best on the First Amendment. When I left Congress, I concluded my speech with 5 items that we should look at. And the number 1 was freedom of expression. Figuring if we have freedom of expression, then it's up to us, present our case. But once that's undermined, and I think it's more undermined now than it was 5 years ago when I left the Congress. Now, 4 of those items in the First Amendment are sort of property type of things: assembly and press and speech and religion. But the one is petitioning. Petitioning the government. They put that in there because if you don't have access to the government, you can have freedom of speech, but if government won't listen to you or even allow you in the door. Now, I think John does a pretty good job in pointing out some of these obstacles put in the way of people who are frustrated and angry and upset and want to do anything, but they're having trouble getting their message in to their representatives in Washington.
Yeah, John spoke at our conference in August and does a terrific job, obviously, with the Rutherford Institute. But I think we wanted to start with John's article because we're looking at restrictions on speech, and he outlines one, which is what you've just mentioned, petitioning the government. He writes about the government restricting the ability to demonstrate in front of the White House. Instead of a 25-foot area, there's going to be just a little 5-foot area where you shrink in, causing there to be large security and cleanup fees if you want to have a demonstration in the National Mall, which will restrict and make it more difficult for groups to be seen in Washington. So he points it out very, very well, and actually there's a great quote from his article that I think is worth reading because he always has these great zingers. But he nails government censorship. He said, censorship and political correctness not only produce people who cannot speak for themselves, but also people who cannot think for themselves. And a citizenry that can't think for itself is a citizenry that will neither rebel against government dictates nor revolt against government tyranny.
Talking about restrictions on what one can do in expressing themselves, I remember very clearly a frustrating evening during the 1988 Libertarian campaign. I was the nominee for the Libertarians, and we wanted to do some filming and do a commercial. So we went to the Jefferson Monument, and we go in there and we set up our cameras and all. We're ready to go. Oh no, this is restricted. All we wanted to do was emphasize, freedom of expression. But anyway, we got kicked out of there, and that was when we had a very conservative president who probably was totally unaware of the rules. But you just can't go in and take a picture of Jefferson to make a point.
National security. Right. But the people who expect the attacks on free speech to come in the form of jackbooted policemen and shutting down your newspaper. In today's day and age, I think they're missing the point. I think what we're seeing, and we're both struggling with this. We've talked about this a lot. We talk about it on the show as well. And we talk about it amongst ourselves. We're seeing the U.S. government, and especially the elites in Washington, essentially outsourcing the job of being the jackbooted thugs shutting down newspapers, outsourcing it to this kind of amorphous pseudo-private sector. In the title, we call it Corporatist. And it's hard to get our hands around, but we're seeing it happen right in front of us. No,
it's getting more difficult than ever, and we've talked about this out of the frustration. But the more I think about it, the more my conclusion is that these corporations need more charges made against them as being part of the government than working hard to protect their rights as an independent company. They're not an independent company. If you look at the way they were established, if you look at their contracts, their immunity, if they promise us, they break the contract and give the information and let the government come in and do anything they want, so they're breaking a contract. But if you sue them, they have immunity just like government has immunity. And you see people, even more so now than ever, some of the big corporations and social media are actually admitting it. And say, yeah, we should do this. We should work with the government, and it's harder to say it. It's not like if you had a newspaper back in the old days and you just published articles against the president, and they send a squad in. They say, you're closed down. You're out of business. It's not so simple now, and in a way, they have been able to sort of neutralize the libertarian position because we're so careful in not wanting to regulate and say, well, if people are saying something we don't like, that we become the censor. So this is more difficult. It's a technological age, and unfortunately, when we're trying to protect this, it becomes more complex. And right now, they're pretty much in a driver's seat because they can practically dictate, how long we'll be doing this program. I'm still optimistic enough to think there's enough smart people out there in technology, and I know they're working on all the time to have alternatives to these huge media groups. So if we can retain that amount of freedom of expression where you can compete even with the government, I think we can survive it all. But right now it's a little shaky. Maybe it's good that we wake up now and look at this before a lot more people suffer from the consequence of government regulation and closing down our right to express ourselves.
We've talked about it already. They call it the Great Alternative Media Purge from Facebook and Twitter, and it was in a coordinated purge. If you were purged at Facebook, Twitter, a completely supposedly different private company, was also purging these same people. And it was about 800 accounts, including some that are very well known, particularly to libertarians and civil libertarians. For example, the Free Speech Project, the Free Thought Project, the Anti-Media, Cop Block, a lot of these, and they were called political spam. All of these sites questioning government, questioning the police. And so we're looking at what is this merger? How do we see the private sector and the government sector merging? Well, one of them we mentioned before is, before the show, is this kind of revolving door. And here's something that was interesting in some of the preparation we were looking at. So Facebook released a statement saying, here's why we're purging these 800 sites. And it was a really crazy statement if you read it because it made no sense. But if you dig a little deeper, the guy who authored it is Facebook's head of cybersecurity. His name is Nathaniel Gleicher. Okay? He was Obama's White House National Security Council Director of Cybersecurity Policy. This is a guy who, through the administration, so of course he's going to come out and do the bidding of the state, of the elites, of the deep state, whatever you want to call them. This is the marriage of these pseudo-private companies, I think, and government officials.
It's important to understand why free speech is the target, because of something I've said before, and a lot of people recognize truth is treasonous in an empire of lies. Because if the empire is depending on lying and kidding us and fooling us like they're doing, and that they're saying, oh, we're the constitutionalists, except, under these circumstances, that they can't stand to have somebody point the finger at them and say, this is the truth. And then, of course, people get into all this kind of trickery about fake language and fake news and all this, trying to seek it. But it shouldn't be that hard to seek out the truth. But I see the attack on people who tell the truth as part of the overall movement toward collectivism. Because in collectivism, everybody exists for the state. Everybody exists for society, not for the individual. The individual is worthless. Matter of fact, they put the pedestal so high that it becomes a religious thing. And many leaders in a collective state become their God.
Yeah.
And so we have moved in that direction, and therefore truth is determined, by the collective, and that is arbitrary. And just look when we look at, just what happened on the Kavanaugh appointment. Not that we were picking sides so much on that; we were trying to pick out the truth. But there was a lot of distortion, in truth, and it was irrelevant.
Yeah.
They almost admit it, and then they laugh about it. We fooled you, and they'll just go back to doing it. You catch them in one lie, they go and switch it to another lie. And I don't think, although these recent months, it's sort of been dominated by reports of this activity from the Democrats, but it's not like it's just one party, because both parties participate in this deception. But deception and borderlines on when people are literally telling a lie to enhance the state in order to destroy our liberties, that's the real challenge, and we'll do our best to sort that out.
And as you mentioned earlier, government desire to silence dissent goes way back. It may go back to Jesus Christ, the silencing people who speak out against the government. But so we're trying to figure out what is new here. How is it different? And what is social media? Social media is essentially a delivery device. When we started the Ron Paul Institute, we started our website, we put up our articles, we worked hard writing articles. And social media facilitated the distribution of our articles to a wider group of people. They didn't have to physically click on our site every time they wanted to read. They could just subscribe to our line on Facebook or Twitter and subscribe and see what we do. So it's a delivery vehicle. You think about just like maybe the first written books were a delivery vehicle. They took the place of oral histories and oral stories. The Pony Express, a delivery vehicle. So essentially that's the role that they've become. But they've, and I don't want to go into the area of them being considered a common carrier, but it is the issue. This is the role that they play, and so they're able to throttle voices that the state doesn't like to hear.
Right, and they have much invested in this. I mean, their existence depends on it. And they have such a miserable message, they have to lie about it. And I think, there's been a couple campaigns recently that some of the candidates were trapped, into discussing what was going on. And they literally said, I can't say that. I can't tell them the truth about what I'm really going to do or the way I'm going to vote. So their dependence on it is to deceive the people. And of course, when you have the arm of the government helping them. But it isn't, we're thinking so much now domestic, but a lot of this is international too. When you think about our involvement overseas, with our special forces and the CIA, the CIA is involved in this all the time. They're involved with elections and propaganda, getting involved in businesses and buying, media outlet. And this is just part of this obsession with their fear of liberty.
Yeah.
They cannot stand it because they lose their power. The king has no clothes. And no, we know we are the king and we need our crown and we are going to maintain it at all costs. And then there's a band of people, a massive band with various interests. And they get together and they say, well, it's just the majority speaking. And to the heck with the minority. Yeah. Of course, our system that was designed, the founders designed it, was to protect the minority. And right now, those minorities now that are trying to give information out and just talk about, what if they decide that it's not a nice thing to talk about the Federal Reserve? All of a sudden, what if they come to realize, we can't allow this to happen because they've caught on to this counterfeiting machine. So, they're going to come down hard. And how many people have an interest in the fraud of the Federal Reserve? A lot of people, every from left, right, middle, foreigners and everybody else. They depend on this and they don't want that to come down. So we're all vulnerable, and truth is something that they detest the most and they fear the most. And that's why I think just speaking of the truth is pretty powerful, and it's had a record for having a reputation for being powerful. And I think that, matter of fact, I happen to believe in that ultimately, but in the meantime, you have to struggle.
And you talk about rigging elections, and that's exactly what we do overseas. But, we both read this great piece by Daisy Luther, and she's the organic prepper, and Lou Rockwell picked it up, and we picked it up too. But she makes a very good point that the social media companies, which we've already demonstrated are infested with government employees who I'm sure want to go back into government. This guy at Facebook, he's going to want to go back into if Hillary wins. You better believe it. So she points out that they are suspending all of these accounts by saying that they are political spam. They're rigging our elections. They're fixing things. So they're silencing all of these alternative media platforms. And she points out by doing that, they're the ones rigging the elections, because as she points out in the 2016 campaign, it was the alternative sites that were digging into things about Hillary, things that the mainstream media wouldn't touch because they were all in for her, totally 100%. So the alternative sites were digging things up, things that she did, her corrupt past, all of these things. And so that's what they want. And so Americans, when they started seeing these things on alternative sites, they made up their mind, armed with information that the mainstream would not provide them. So they're the riggers.
Yeah. And the point is things are worse now than they were 2 or 3 years ago.
Yeah.
It keeps getting worse because the more the truth gets out, the harder they're going to crack down on them. But there will be a limitation on this. Just as I say, there's a limitation on our terrible foreign policy. There's going to be a limitation on the attack on the people, because finally people will give up, things will break down, and people, will be some type of modern day pamphleteering. Just think, the colonists won with pamphlets,
yeah.
And they didn't have to have any super outlet, but they were spreading the truth too and talking about liberty, and that won out. So I may be naive at times. I've been accused of that, but I really believe that if we have a good message, a truthful message, and it's on the side of liberty, that that's what the people want if they only understand it. It's sort of back to the old saying, the people don't want war, it's the politicians that want war. So if the people want their privacy and they want the government out of our lives and out of our pocketbooks, then they will respond to us. But sometimes a free lunch is awfully appealing. Free lunches are appealing, but also the fear is intimidating too, because we know that everything that we do is possibly being noticed by others, and so therefore we're very much aware of what can happen.
And then we talk about self-censorship. If people feel that way, they may not say what they want to say.
Right.
But one of the things about the Facebook, how they use to determine who to kick off, they use the Atlantic Council, which is NATO's think tank. They use NATO to tell which sites are fake and which are not fake. And the Atlantic Council, they just received a $1 million award from the State Department. So this is a pseudo-government agency that is working with Facebook. And let's bring it a little bit closer to home, because our summer graduate student intern Patrick Henningsen, who was here and we did a show with him, he was attacked by name in the Atlantic Council's publication, the Digital Forensic Research Lab blog, attacked him by name because he has posted information about John McCain and how close he was to some neo-Nazis in Ukraine. This is hardly a secret. There's a picture of McCain next to the guy who is in the neo-Nazi party there. But so they picked this to say how discredited this Henningsen guy was. And here's what they said. Here's how they referenced our former intern. Henningsen is a conspiracy blogger and Kremlin supporter who runs the 21st Century News Wire, a 9/11 truther site. He should not be considered a credible commentator. Now these are the people who are deciding who's allowed to be on Facebook. It's not a 9/11 conspiracy site, as we know, because we've interviewed Vanessa Beeley several times on this show, who writes for 21st Century Wire. And what does she do? She goes to Syria, is among the only Western journalists on the ground in Syria, reporting that, hey, the white helmets are not the guys on the white horses that they're cracked up to be in the U.S. mainstream media. So this is not a 9/11 truth site, but they're damned by this government-funded group, and they may be the next ones to be taken off. So that next person taken off can be you if you dare speak the truth. We don't have the answers for what's happening, but we are definitely recognizing the problem. Dr. Paul?
Well, obviously there's an incestuous relationship between business and government now, and sorting that out is different, because we as libertarians believe in the free market, and it's okay to make money if you're serving the consumer, and as long as you're not using any function of violence, and people should be able to get ahead. Matter of fact, it makes the world go round. And then I happen to believe that that type of society is more generous than any other society, because there's a lot of wealth. But this relationship between big business and government is something that we can't ignore. We refer to it as corporatist or corporatism because it's a combination, and we don't use the word of fascism. As an all-tale name. But right now there's a lot of people accusing other people of being fascist. But like we mentioned in the article, sometimes the people who shout the loudest of somebody doing something, people who are shouting the loudest of who are the fascists are the fascists themselves. And that's what we have to realize. But I don't think there's any doubt that the way we're moving, if we don't reverse it, we are going toward a fascist society. A lot more dangerous than, a corporatist society where there's, association, but not absolute. But we're moving toward a fascist society. But I think it's going to be different just because of the technology. And we're approaching that. And I think that's what we were touching on today, even haven't changed in the last couple years, that the corporations and the governments are getting together through technology, hiding behind this stuff, hiding behind the argument, oh, we're free market people and these are private group and we have a right to do this. But words are important and philosophy is important, and the coming together of big business and big government, I think is very, very dangerous. There should be a sharp separation of church and state. I think there should be a separation of state and business people. And the government should exist for very, very few reasons. One is to protect the liberty, and then we would find out what the truth really is. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.